Be on. Let me start the record option here. But a lot of terminology, a whole lot of terminology. And one thing you saw on FRQs is they may ask you to look at a graph, a chart, a map, and talk about different political units and their scales, like the county level um, scale, or the state level scale, or the country level scale, or the international level scale. There are different units of government throughout the world. There's international government, there's county government, so forth. I don't need to say that again. But with that, then they all make different decisions and have different responsibilities and sometimes have to work together, which brings us back to what is political geography and a term that I think is very important, geopolitics. So political geography is just about how we basically, people around the world, have set laws and rules for how we govern the space we live on. That's political geography. Geopolitics is a term you could see. I could, within one of the prompts, definitely could envision this. It's basically modern world issues of how countries get along with each other. That's what geopolitics is. So a major geopolitical issue would have to do with relationships between countries if they don't like each other and they're arguing over a border, or if they're best friends. That's all related to geopolitics. Now, there's also different types of political systems and different types of governments. I'm not going to go through that because that's one of those things, if you've got good notes handy and you need to make a reference of what a real democracy is, which is majority rule, basically, what a republic is, what a dictatorship is. I mean, those things should be simple, but you're not going to be defining those. What you might do is, as we mentioned earlier today with India and China, is describe how both of those two countries took different approaches to try to control their population growth and the political elements. Or what you might have to do is explain why it was important for India's government to be supportive of the Green Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. Otherwise, that might have failed. Or possibly, what if a government's not supportive of a certain policy, and how does that impact long-term economics, environment, whatever? That's the kind of questions I think you're going to see. Some other key areas with political geography, I think, centripetal and centrifugal forces are, I really hammer those home, I mean, every year now, because I think that is extremely important. You know how they're related to things like devolution, centrifugal forces anyway. You know how they're related to linguistic diversity and religious diversity and stuff like that. So just practice centrifugal and centripetal forces. And most of all, what most of y'all need to help on is explaining better why those forces are divisive or why they're unifying, and like completing that loop, that if people have different languages, why is it they don't get along maybe so well? Okay, so Lauren was asking about maybe later today in the last Zoom at 7, summing some things up. And I do plan on doing that in some way. I kind of feel like that agricultural one might have a lot of questions, but I do plan toward the end of the Zoom tonight to sum up kind of, if I guess this makes sense, kind of my top list of what I think the most likely FRQ scenarios are. So I do plan on doing that a little bit. And then Gracie asked, well, how did India try to control population? And really, India, because it's a federal system, and there's two other terms we got to know, federal system and unitary. They love asking about those on FRQs. So we got to know those. They might ask you, explain one positive of having a federal system, explain a positive of having a unitary system. And so while China could put, because they're unitary, China could put a one-child law in place. India couldn't really do that because India has a federal system, which means there's a shared power between the local and the federal governments, which basically kind of like Canada and America, which means that India's big government, their federal government, they had to basically go to the local government and say, we want to control population. It's really important. We're worried about poverty. We're worried about starvation and all this, which ties back to the Green Revolution too. But they couldn't make them. All they could do is say, this is going to be our policy nationally. You need to enact it at your level. It's kind of like how education works in the United States. We have some national guidelines, but then it's up to the states to actually design. That's why your state testing is designed at, their Tennessee test, TCAPS or whatever, right? And that's kind of what happened in India. So to make a long story short, India's approach to controlling fertility rates and birth rates was very regional, very varied, because it's a federal system. Some states, the governments put in more draconian, which means strict measures, while others were more relaxed measures. We're just kind of suggestive, some propaganda, some stuff like that. And in some Indian states, fertility rates dropped drastically, some gradually dropped, and some didn't drop very much at all. So there was a very varied response, and that's what happens in a federal system. You're going to have different styles of government, different ways of doing things in different places. Keep going back to COVID-19, but basically in the United States, most of the decisions have been made to the states to make decisions of how much to lock down or how much to shut down. And, this thing has been totally, puzzling in many ways. There is no way right now that you can look at what this state did or that state did and say they did it right and they did it wrong. For one, we don't have enough data. And for two, some states that shut just about everything down have been the worst states impacted. And some states have, seemingly done very well at shut everything down. And some states that didn't shut down very much have done very well as far as avoiding major impact as well. So again, but that's how the key for us is federal systems are going to have more varied responses from local governments. And of course, then there's another dimension to that, another scale, analysis scale, is the state governments then have to work with county and city governments. So that's another item that we don't have to worry about for this test too much, but in normal years, that would have been in the urban geography unit. We would have talked about city government and stuff like that, but that would be a totally different scale. So you got centrifugal, devolution. We've talked about a lot today. Supranationalism. Remember, devolution is the breakdown of power at the federal level. So in other words, if a country was having lots of centrifugal issues, you might have devolution in that country that made it more of a federal system and provided more local power, potentially. But devolution also is the breaking away, a South Sudan, Crimea, or what is wanted in potentially Scotland, or what Quebec voted for at one time, or what the Basque might want, or what the Catalans may want. Again, there's two versions of devolution. There is the version where you are giving more local autonomy or semi-autonomy, and then there's the complete breakaway. But a lot of that is rooted in different political, cultural beliefs, different ideas, people wanting to do things in a different way, in a different manner. Right? Supranationalism, of course, is two or more countries coming together to do something politically, economically, or militarily, or all of the above, to work for the benefit of others. I could envision, always centripetal and centrifugal is possible, even if they don't mention the words on an FRQ, stuff that brings a country together, tears it apart, that's always a possibility. That's a top 20, if not a top 10. But I think supranationalism is probably a higher likelihood. Just a guess, kind of. Top 15, if not top 10, with supranationalism, that they might could give you some statistics from the EU. They might give you statistics of Southeast Asian Nation Association. In other words, they will give you some information in your stimulus, but then ask you, maybe explain how a supranational organization promotes an increase in trade. Explain how a supranational organization might bring about cultural objections or social objections in a country. That's the kind of questions we're looking at, I think, related to supranationalism. How it relates to nationalism. It's the total opposite. Nationalism is about promoting the good of your country, and that's the prime purpose, or the prime thing your goal is. Supranationalism basically means beyond national. So it's like a more global, or at least regional or super regional perspective. All right. So I do think that one is very, very likely. Gerrymandering is always a possibility. I put up some pictures today of some other FRQs from study guides, and gerrymandering is on one of those. There's also a gerrymandering optional FRQ in AP Classroom if you want to get one of your last ones in on that. It's an FRQ that is not really that tricky, but a lot of people have struggled with it that have done it. But the focus on that one, remember gerrymandering, what a lot of people are struggling with, making the connection of gerrymandering and the census. And I know that we were not in school. We were doing this virtually when we went over this. So, I mean, I know that takes away a chance to ask some questions, although, we've got a little better at that. Gerrymandering is done because every 10 years in this country, other countries, it's different measurements, we have a census, which we have this year. And in that census, there is a law that says we have to redraw the local voting districts because population changes, demography. And the reason you're redrawing the districts, this is what everybody's missing, almost everybody. The reason you're redrawing the districts is the purpose of the law is that we will have equal representation across the country and across our states. So that if one place loses 5 million people who move out, another place gains 3 million, we need to redraw the boundaries to make people's votes equitable, okay? So we got to understand that, and that's what a lot of people are not understanding that. So that's why there needs to be a redrawing of legislative boundaries. Gerrymandering is redrawing them in a way that favors one political party and produces odd-shaped boundaries. And it can be done by Republicans, Democrats, or whatever country you're in. It can be done by other parties as well. And what they'll do is whoever's in power, whoever's got the majority in that state, when the census numbers come back, they then try to take those often, not all the time, but often, they try to, and it's illegal, but it's, again, hard to change and hard to prove. They take those numbers and they redraw the districts for political benefit of their party. And we talked about the wasted vote and the stacked vote and the excess vote. If you want those definitions, probably somewhere you could access them if you needed to, but I wouldn't worry as much about that as the idea of what does that do to the voting process? What are the implications? What are the consequences of gerrymandering? Well, one consequence is people often feel like their vote doesn't matter because the same people are winning over and over again. Because sometimes gerrymandering is done in what we call the excess vote. Okay, or I'm sorry, let's say that one right. You got excess, wasted, and stacked. Right? Actually, be the stacked vote, where you basically stack up Republicans in one district, Democrats in another district, and everybody ends up knowing, what party's going to win every time. So voter participation goes down. And sometimes the same candidates are winning over and over again. And so it's like it's a foregone conclusion that people know who's going to win. There's less interest in the election. There's less accountability for the people in charge, and there's less voter interest, so people don't turn out to vote. Also, another impact of gerrymandering sometimes is basically segregation in voting districts of minorities. And so if most minorities, let's say it's a Hispanic community or it's an African-American community, and they're more Democratic likely to vote for the Democratic Party, then if the Republicans are in charge, they might try to basically an excess vote, put all of, or as many as they can, of the African-American voters or the Hispanics in the same district, basically saying, we know you're going to win that one, but we'll make sure we win the other. The Democrats are going to win that one, but we're going to make sure we win the others. And that's kind of how this plays out on the long term. Remember, the rule for gerrymandering or the rule for redistricting is it has to be a continuous voting district. It's got to, it can't have breaks in it. And that's why you get some of the funny boundaries. As Gracie said, the goal of redistributing to make the same number of people in each district or even number, it's to make, so the goal of redistricting, the reason we draw the boundaries, what Gracie's asking about, is to try to make the same number of people be represented in each district. The goal of gerrymandering is to make it where it favors a political party. Now, there is not, I know I haven't answered one part of your question yet, Gracie. The goal of redistricting is supposedly to make the districts as best they can resemble the state as a whole. But that's tricky because, as we often group in cultural enclaves or the places we live in, people are more like us, then it's going to be, even if you try to do the fairest possible drawing there is out there, it's going to be hard not to have, maybe the state's 55%, 45%. It's still going to be hard not to have one district that's 60%, 65% one party and another one 70% another party, because of just the makeup of the population in those locations. But to review, redistricting's goal is to equal the population among districts for equal representation. Gerrymandering's goal, which is illegal, but it's happened in many, many states. Gerrymandering's goal is for the political party in charge to gain favor by drawing weird-looking boundaries that basically limit the political power of the other party. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to enforce is, even when it's been declared illegal before, often the courts have not said what the answer is. In other words, do they have to redraw the boundaries right away, or does it just wait until the next census or the next elections? And it's kind of been wide open. North Carolina has been a place that has had some issues related to that. Maryland, several states that have dealt with gerrymandering issues. So gerrymandering definitely one issue that we didn't get to talk about while we were in class. So I wanted to spend a little more time on that right now. Terrorism's another one. Now, the thing is, on the standards, if you look at them, terrorism is not mentioned very much in these new standards. I think as long as you understand the radical nature and the idea that terrorists they have a political motive, and they're trying to attack people that are not just military but civilian, and they've got some agenda they want to accomplish, is the general rule. There's no one definition of a terrorist. But what you do need to know, I think, is how terrorism plays a geopolitical role in our world today. I mean, that is one of the major geopolitical concerns around our world today, is how to combat terrorism, whether it's the Israelis and Palestinians, whether it's Kashmir and it's India and Pakistan, because there's political disagreement, there's cultural disagreement in all those locations I just mentioned. And with that, some of the radicals may manipulate the situation and carry out violence in order to try to accomplish a goal. And again, that's happened in Northern Ireland. It happened back in the mid 20th century. And so there's been many examples of it. Some of the Basque turned to radicalism. But again, the whole thing is usually with definitions, terrorists involve people who are not just committing crimes, but crimes that they have an agenda to get a point across in doing, at the end of the day, they want their country to be sovereign, or they want to break away from this, or they want to get rid of this leader. And so therefore they're carrying out these violent acts and terrorizing, intimidating citizens, not just, again, people in the military, to make that happen. The other thing on geopolitical issues related to that is some countries have been accused of being sponsors of terrorism or supporters of terrorism. And that's got to do with the fact that others believe they have secretly or not so secretly funded, provided information, supported terrorist group. Now, there is a gray line, or there's a fuzzy line sometimes when it comes to labeling somebody a terrorist. And we didn't get to talk about this in class at all, I don't think. But I could give you some examples. I'm not going to go through it right now because I don't think terrorism is high likelihood on the test. But if it were to show up, I think it would be something that had a lot of parts of political or cultural or something like that. But basically, terrorism today is a major issue. And when you look at it as far as countries dealing with it, the gray line I was talking about, if people are raised in certain situations and basically their family, their neighbors are affected by something and they only know that part of the story, it's not that hard to see where that person could become vigilant, and where that person, before they know it, could be brought into a terrorist group and really not know what they're getting involved in. And that was very common with ISIS, is a lot of people who got involved in it didn't know what all they were getting involved with to start with. Some did, but some people didn't. So that basically is the major political. Again, if I had to guess, centrifugal forces or something connected to that. Devolution is always a possibility, but devolution was on the test last year. So if I had to pick, supranationalism would be at the top of my chart in political geography. And then federal and unitary systems. A few years ago, there was a FRQ that showed Germany and I can't remember the other state, but it showed two states, and they were basically showed the way they were divided up by states. And in that, you had to decide. Actually, I think you all did that one. You had to decide which one was the federal system and the unitary system. And a lot of people freaked out, and a lot of people were thinking, "Well, I don't know what Germany is." And I'm like, "Did you look at the map?" Again, trust your stimuli. The map of Germany was divided into like 14 pieces, meaning states, political units is what we call them. The other map, I think it was a South American country, I don't remember. No, it was Japan. I believe it was Japan. Okay, so Japan was not divided, I don't think, or if it was just like a couple places. It was a unitary system. I'm like, trust the map. If you don't know if one's federal and one's unitary, look at the map. There's a reason those lines exist that separate so many parts of Germany. All right. So again, a lot of times the stimulus will provide you answers if you will just trust it. Okay. All right. I'll open it up at this point for questions.